Hey there, everybody. We're back for part 2 of our classification activity. What you should have is by now a classification system that you have created using your 12 objects. Not just the classification system, but also you should have scientific names for each one of your objects. If you will recall from our first video, the way in which I classified my organisms, or at least that I started to, is I started with all of the nuts and bolts. I then broke them up between metal and plastic. And then I modeled at least how we might do the plastic ones. We could break these up by color, the characteristic of color, one being white, one being blue. And then I said, all right, well, let's look at these metal ones. Obviously, there's a lot of metal objects here, but how could I, based on a characteristic, how could I split them up? And you'll recall that I split them up based on whether or not they had ridges, these things, or whether or not they were smooth. So I took them all and I split them. That's smooth. That's got a smooth outside. This one's got ridges. It's kind of hard to see, but this has ridges also. And that's where I left you off. That was part 1. Part 1 was showing and modeling how we're going to get a classification system. Now, please note, I'm not done here. You know you're done when you have individuals or you have items that are exactly the same all the way out in your classification system, all the way down to, call it, quote unquote, the species level. So these two groups aren't done because obviously I've got ones that have ridges that are different, and I've got ones that are smooth that are different. So I would have continued to classify those out. Now, based on this classification system then, part 2 is you creating and writing your own dichotomous key, your own taxonomic key. Now I want to model how we would go about doing that. So I'm gonna put all my nuts and bolts right back up at the kingdom level, and I'm gonna bring in a second piece of paper to show you how we would go about doing this. Remember, a dichotomous key, a series of statements that we would use to identify an organism by name. Well, I've started with all of my nuts and bolts. So the first characteristic that I used to split these nuts and bolts up was, what are they made out of? So the first, number 1A, would be, is the item or the organism, is the item plastic? B, is the item metal? See, there's my characteristics. And then I'm going to send the reader, the person that's using the key, I'm going to send that person to another number in the key. So why don't I go ahead and make number 2, where I'm sending the plastic, and why don't I make number 3, where I'm sending people for the metal? So my number 2 in my key, and my number 3 in the key, number 2 where the plastic is going, and where the metal is going. So my next characteristic for plastic, if they're identifying something as being plastic, remember the next characteristic was their color. All right. So number 2, what were the 2 different colors that I had? 2A is the item white. B is the item blue. Or you could say this, the item is blue, the item is white. That doesn't matter. Okay? But here's the thing. With these plastic ones, is there anywhere else to go in the key? Okay? I know I kind of have this off to the side here, but you notice that there was only one white and there was only one blue. We are at the end of the key. So if we're at the end of the key, all right, and the item is plastic and it is white, we have identified it by name. Plasticus whitus. And if it was blue, we've identified it by name as Plasticus bluus. I'm going to go ahead and underline both those because I want to make sure that I'm following the rules of scientific naming. So as you can see here, I'll put it there in the middle, that if I'm identifying a plastic white object, then I know that it is Plasticus whitus. If it's plastic and it's blue, then I know that its scientific name is Plasticus bluus. Well, what about the metal column? Well, let's just go ahead and demonstrate at least the beginnings of how we would go about this metal. Well, what was the next classification category that I used for my metal? Was whether or not they were smooth or rigid. So in my key, I sent everyone to number 3 if it was metal. So 3A, you'll remember, I can make as smooth, and 3B, I can make, well, they have ridges. So 3A has ridges. 3B is smooth. If I am identifying this, okay, remember, I don't want to call it a nail because really I'm just concerned with its characteristics. If I'm identifying this, I know that it's metal and I know that it is smooth. So in my key, I know that I haven't finished my classification system. Remember, this was just a model, but in my key, I'm going to send the ridges to number 4, and then I can send my smooth to number 5. So what you're going to be doing is you are going to be taking your completed, remember this system was not complete because I had all my smooths, I had multiple different smooths items, I'll show you a few, that aren't the same. Yes, they're all smooth, yes, they're all made out of metal, but they are not the same. So this key would have continued to break out into different categories. What you're doing now in part 2 is you're taking your classification system and you are writing your own dichotomous key. You're going to end up with 12 different organisms. Now, I don't know how many steps you're going to end up having. That's up to you and your classification system. But you will end up writing a key that can correctly identify all 12 of your items, all 12 of your organisms, whatever 12 objects you chose around your house with scientific names. Now remember, if you need samples other than this short mini lesson, if you need samples, go back into the assignments for dichotomous keys and look at how the alien key was written. That was more of a fun one. Look at how the leaf key was written. Look at how the shark key was written. Even then, go back and look at the mini lesson on dichotomous keys and those birds and those the short bird key that we looked at. So you've got a lot of resources, including this short mini lesson on how to write a dichotomous key and what it is that you're going to need to do to complete part 2 of this activity.